April 1, 1945. Easter Sunday. The East China Sea, off the coast of Okinawa. General Mitsuru Ushijima stood in his command post deep inside the limestone caves of the Shuri Castle complex and reviewed the intelligence reports that confirmed what he had been expecting for weeks. The largest fleet ever assembled in the Pacific War was anchored offshore. 1,300 ships. 180,000 American troops waiting to come ashore. The most powerful invasion force in the history of the Pacific Theater was pointed at his island. Ushijima was not concerned about the landing. He had ordered his men to let the Americans come ashore. All of them. He wanted the beaches clear of Japanese defenders when the American troops crossed them. He wanted the Americans to land easily, to advance inland without resistance, to begin thinking that Okinawa was going to be the easy operation that some of their commanders had suggested it might be. He wanted them deep inside the island before they discovered what he had built. What Ushijima had built in the southern third of Okinawa was the most sophisticated defensive system in the Pacific War, more elaborate than Peleliu, more thoroughly integrated with the terrain, more carefully designed to inflict maximum casualties over maximum time. The Japanese High Command had given him a mission not of victory but of delay. Every day that Ushijima's 110,000 soldiers kept the Americans fighting on Okinawa was a day that Japan used to prepare the home islands for the invasion that was coming. The kamikazes that were being prepared by the thousands in Kyushu needed time. The defensive fortifications being built on the beaches of the Japanese home islands needed time. The suicide boats and the suicide swimmers and the underground factories and everything else that Japan was assembling for the final battle needed time. Ushijima's job was to buy that time with his soldiers' lives and his own. He intended to do it. The Americans who came ashore on the beaches of Okinawa on April 1, 1945, encountered something so unexpected that many of them initially assumed it was a trap. The beaches were empty. No artillery fire fell on the landing craft as they crossed the reef. No machine guns swept the shoreline. No mortars targeted the men as they waded through the surf. The elaborate pre-landing bombardment that the Navy had delivered for days had suppressed nothing because there was nothing to suppress. The Japanese were not on the beaches. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commanding the 10th Army, was cautiously optimistic. His intelligence had warned him that Okinawa would be costly. The size of the defensive force, estimated at 100,000 or more Japanese soldiers, and the terrain of the island's southern third, where aerial photographs showed extensive fortification work, suggested a battle that would dwarf anything the Pacific War had yet produced. But the ease of the landing was encouraging. Perhaps the pre-landing bombardment had been more effective than assessment suggested. Perhaps the Japanese garrison was weaker than intelligence estimated. The first week reinforced this cautious optimism. American forces moved inland rapidly, seizing the island's two main airfields with minimal resistance, cutting the island in half and pushing north and south simultaneously. The northern advance went quickly. The terrain was rugged, but the Japanese forces defending it were relatively few, light infantry units without the fortifications and the artillery that intelligence had warned about. The southern advance was different. As the leading elements of the 7th Infantry Division and the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions pushed toward the island's southern third, they began encountering something that confirmed every warning that had been given and exceeded every estimate of difficulty. The Shuri Line. Ushijima had built his main defensive position around the ancient Shuri Castle, a structure that had dominated the southern Okinawan landscape for 500 years and whose thick stone walls provided a natural anchor for a defensive system that extended east and west across the island's entire width. The Shuri Line was not a line in the conventional military sense. It was a zone of interlocking defensive positions, artillery emplacements, cave systems, and underground tunnels that made the Peleliu defenses look improvised by comparison. The terrain that Ushijima had chosen for his defense was itself a weapon. The ridges and hills that studded the island's southern third bore names that American soldiers would carry with them for the rest of their lives: Sugarloaf Hill, Chocolate Drop Hill, Strawberry Hill, Half Moon Hill, names that the units assigned to take them coined from their shapes and that bore no relationship to the horror of what happened on them. The Maeda Escarpment, a cliff that rose 150 feet above the surrounding terrain, was called Hacksaw Ridge by the soldiers who fought for it, and the name reflected both the physical reality of the terrain and the nature of the fighting it produced. The battle for the Shuri Line lasted from early April through late May 1945, nearly 7 weeks of fighting in rain and mud and heat against defensive positions that were reinforced continuously through the tunnel system that connected every part of the Japanese defense. American units that seized a position during the day found Japanese defenders reoccupying it through tunnels overnight. Artillery that destroyed a position on one ridge revealed another position behind it. The advance was measured in yards and paid for in lives at a rate that was unprecedented even in the context of the Pacific War's accumulated horror. Private Desmond Doss was not supposed to be there. A Seventh-day Adventist whose religious convictions prevented him from carrying a weapon, Doss had enlisted as a combat medic over the objections of an army that had tried repeatedly to discharge him and the hostility of fellow soldiers who had questioned his courage. At Hacksaw Ridge on May 5, 1945, Doss's unit had seized the escarpment and then been driven back by a Japanese counterattack, leaving dozens of wounded men on top of the ridge in a position so exposed that any attempt to reach them during daylight seemed suicidal. Doss went up anyway. He went up alone, without a weapon, with nothing but his medical kit and his faith, and he spent the next 12 hours on top of Hacksaw Ridge in darkness lit by explosions and Japanese flares, finding wounded men, treating them, and lowering them one by one over the edge of the cliff on a rope sling he had improvised from his own equipment. He lowered 75 men down that cliff. Each trip to find another man exposed him to the Japanese forces who were still on the ridge. He was wounded multiple times during the night and refused evacuation, treating his own wounds and returning to find more men. Doss received the Medal of Honor for what he did on Hacksaw Ridge. When President Truman placed the medal around his neck, Truman told him that he would rather have that medal than be president. It was the kind of thing presidents say in Medal of Honor ceremonies, but the men who had been on Hacksaw Ridge believed it was true. While the infantry fought for the ridges of the Shuri Line, the Navy offshore was facing a different kind of horror that no previous battle had produced on the same scale. The kamikazes. Japan had been developing and deploying kamikaze tactics since the Philippines campaign in October 1944, but it was at Okinawa that the program reached its full and terrible development. Operation Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums, sent wave after wave of suicide aircraft against the American fleet supporting the Okinawa operation. In 10 major Kikusui attacks and hundreds of smaller ones, approximately 1,900 kamikaze aircraft were expended against the American fleet. The men aboard the destroyers and destroyer escorts that formed the radar picket line around Okinawa experienced the kamikaze attacks with an intimacy that the larger ships in the fleet did not. The picket line existed to provide early warning of incoming aircraft and to direct the combat air patrol that defended against them. It was also, by virtue of its position, the first thing the kamikazes reached when they came in from the north. The destroyers on picket duty were the most exposed ships in the fleet, and they knew it. Destroyer sailors who survived the Okinawa campaign described the kamikaze attacks with the particular vocabulary of men who had experienced something for which the existing language of naval warfare was insufficient. An aircraft that was trying to hit you could be evaded. An aircraft that was trying to fly into you, piloted by a man who had been trained for months for the specific purpose of dying in the act of destroying your ship, was a different kind of threat that required a different kind of response and produced a different kind of fear. The USS Laffey, a destroyer on picket duty, was attacked by 22 kamikaze aircraft in 80 minutes on April 16, 1945. She was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. She should have sunk. Her crew fought the fires and the flooding with the particular determination of men who understood that the ship had to stay afloat because the men on her had no other option, and the Laffey was still floating when the attack stopped. 31 of her crew were dead. She was towed to safety and eventually repaired and returned to service. She is preserved today as a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina, and the marks of the kamikaze hits can still be seen on her hull. The USS Bunker Hill, a fleet carrier, was struck by 2 kamikazes in 30 seconds on May 11, 1945, killing 393 men and wounding 264 more, the second highest casualty total for a single ship in the Pacific War. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carrier task force from the Bunker Hill, transferred his flag to another carrier while the Bunker Hill's crew fought fires that burned for hours. The carrier survived and was repaired, but she did not return to combat before the war ended. In total, the kamikaze campaign at Okinawa sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others, killed approximately 5,000 American sailors and wounded nearly 5,000 more. It was the most costly campaign for the American Navy in the entire war, and it confirmed for American planners what they had suspected since the kamikazes first appeared at Letta Gulf. The invasion of the Japanese home islands, planned for November 1945, would produce casualties that no American president could present to the American people as acceptable. On shore, the battle for the Shuri Line reached its climax in late May as Ushijima, recognizing that his position at Shuri Castle could no longer be held, executed a withdrawal to the island's southern tip that American forces were unable to prevent because of the rain and mud that had rendered large-scale maneuver impossible. The withdrawal was itself a remarkable military operation, conducted under American fire through the tunnel system and the broken terrain of the southern island, preserving a significant portion of Ushijima's force for the final defensive battle that he had already planned. The final battle in the south was the last chapter of the same story that had been told since April 1st. Japanese soldiers in prepared positions defending terrain that favored the defender, American soldiers, and Marines attacking across ground that provided no cover, both sides fighting with the understanding that there was no outcome except the complete destruction of one force or the other. American forces reached the southern cliffs of Okinawa in mid-June. Japanese soldiers who had nowhere left to retreat began going over the cliffs rather than surrendering. Ushijima sent his final message to Tokyo on June 22nd, reporting that organized resistance had ended, that his mission had been accomplished as well as human possibility allowed, and that he was about to die. He and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Osamu Cho, performed ritual suicide as the last American forces reached the edge of the cave where they had established their final command post. The Battle of Okinawa was declared secured on June 22, 1945. The campaign had lasted 82 days. The casualty figures from Okinawa were staggering in a way that fundamentally changed American strategic planning for the final phase of the Pacific War. American ground forces suffered 7,613 killed and 31,807 wounded, the highest casualty total for any operation in the Pacific War. American naval forces suffered 5,000 killed and approximately 5,000 wounded in the kamikaze campaign. Total American casualties exceeded 50,000. Japanese military casualties were approximately 110,000 killed. An additional 150,000 Okinawan civilians were killed, roughly one-third of the island's entire civilian population, caught between the two armies in a battle that consumed everything in its path. General Buckner, the 10th Army commander, was killed by Japanese artillery fire on June 18th, for days before the island was secured, the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy action in the Second World War. He died watching his soldiers advance through the last Japanese defensive positions, close enough to the front that the shell that killed him was fired at a range that would have been considered dangerously exposed for a general officer. The strategic consequences of Okinawa reached beyond the island and beyond the Pacific War. The casualty projections that American planners developed based on the Okinawa experience suggested that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, would produce between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties. Japan had prepared 10,000 kamikaze aircraft for the invasion, nearly 7 times the number deployed at Okinawa. Japanese civilian and military casualties in a home islands invasion were projected in the millions. President Truman, reviewing these projections in July 1945, made the decision that ended the war without an invasion. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th were the direct consequence of what had happened on Okinawa, the logical response of a government that had seen what the defense of a peripheral island cost and understood what the defense of the home islands would cost. The men who fought on Okinawa did not know they were preventing an invasion that would have killed 1 million of their fellow Americans. They knew the ridge in front of them and the men beside them and the enemy in the cave positions above them, and they went up the ridges because that was what the situation required. Eugene Sledge, who had survived Peleliu and who fought at Okinawa with the same 1st Marine Division, wrote about the final days of the Okinawa campaign with the voice of a man who had been through things that most human beings cannot imagine and who had come out the other side with the particular knowledge of what war actually is. The mud and the rain and the stench and the Japanese dead and the American dead and the Okinawan dead, Sledge wrote, it was beyond anything that words can carry. We were very tired and very old by the time it ended. Some of us were 19 years old. Some of them were 19 years old. They had been in the Pacific for years, fighting from island to island, carrying the weight of a war that their country had not started and could not end except by finishing it, and they finished it on the southern cliffs of Okinawa in June 1945, while the decision was being made in Washington that would make the invasion of Japan unnecessary. They had done what was asked of them. They had taken every island, held every line, absorbed every kamikaze and every banzai charge and every cave defense that Japan had been able to design, and they had kept coming. They had been 19 years old and they had kept coming. The war ended in August 1945. The men who had fought at Okinawa were still alive, most of them, and they went home to lives that were shaped in ways they could not always articulate by what they had seen and done in the 82 days that began on Easter Sunday 1945 and ended in the mud and the heat of an island that most Americans had never heard of. They had earned their way home the hard way. There was no other way available.